Welcome fans and foes, viewers and haters. I'm your raging Canadian and here's today's review. The holiday season is upon us. Carols are heard, Christmas trees are being put up, and werewolves are being played by Matthew McConaughey's Native American cousins? As tempted as I am to hammer down on New Moon's flaws, I also remember the words of a very, very wise man who said, "Hell hath no fury like a female YouTube viewer." So I'm going to treat this review as professional as possible. But that does not mean I'm going to butter it up for you either, because this is definitely not the best picture of the year. And if any of you girls think that I'm being hard on the movie by the end of this review, that is your problem. First of all, there is a difference between reviewing a book and reviewing the movie it's adapted from. Secondly, I am trying hard to treat this movie fairly, though I still think it is way overhyped. And thirdly, I guarantee you there are a lot of critics online or in print that are criticizing this movie a lot worse than I am, and I will bet you that some of them are even women. New Moon is a sequel to the pop culture phenomenon Twilight, based on the book series written by Stephanie Meyer, which tells the love story of the human Bella Swan and the vampire Edward Cullen. In this movie, however, things get a bit more hyped up, but not by a lot. After an attack from a vampire leaves Edward distraught and contemplating his future with Bella, he decides it's best to leave her alone so she can be protected. While Edward's gone, Bella goes to cry on the shoulder of her friend Jacob Black, who's revealed to be in fact a werewolf. Meanwhile, the shadowy vampire royalty, known as the Volturi, are close to learning of Bella's knowledge of the vampire world. And all the while that's happening, Victoria, a vampire from the last movie, comes seeking revenge on Bella from killing her. Okay, I think you can guess what the first flaw of the movie is. There's too many storylines crowded into one film. The two ones I thought were worth telling were the Volturi and the werewolf mythology, but the conflict with Victoria doesn't seem to go anywhere, and the Volturi one just seems to appear in the beginning and just pop back in the end with barely any build-up. One of the things I liked a bit more in this film was the new direction of Chris Weitz. I think the last movie was just way too dark and gloomy, but this new world seems to have a lot more life and color in it. But direction is nothing without a good script to be molded with it. As I said, there were too many storylines crammed in than necessary, and most of the dialogue felt awkward. I will be honest and say that even though Belle and Edward are supposed to be soulmates, her and Jacob seem to have the better chemistry. But the writing for some of the romantic scenes just didn't seem to fit well into what they were trying to get across. Speaking of performances, let's talk about the big three. You know, there were times in this movie where Bella saw some pretty freaky stuff, and there were only two ways she seemed to handle those kinds of situations. She either doesn't seem to show a lot of emotion in scenes where performance is critical, or she starts running her hands all over herself like she's covered in fleas or something. As for Robert Pattinson, well, his role in the movie is actually not as big as you might have thought it would be, and maybe that was for the best in some cases. His character seemed to have a lot less life in him than the first movie, and in some cases, I thought he was ready to fall asleep. Now what about Taylor Lautner? Or, as he's also known by the girls in the theater I went to, WOO! Well, I thought this new version of Jacob was a bit more thorough compared to what we got in the last movie. Out of the three main actors, I'd say he was the one that worked the hardest. That's worked the hardest, ladies, not worked out the hardest. There are two other performances that I thought were worth mentioning, however brief they were. Michael Sheen, who played the werewolf Lucian in the Underworld series, plays a vampire in this movie named Aro, and as cool as I thought it would be to see him in this role, it seems like he could have done better. His character was very bug-eyed and a little bit of a bottled-up nutcase. It was almost like watching a 12-year-old who's had way too much caffeine. Now on to Dakota Fanning as Jane, a character that is just utterly creepy. Red eyes or not, the way she looks at you is just so friggin' scary. I think she had a lot of potential, but her role felt like more of a cameo. The movie's visual effects seem to be only slightly better than the last film. Clearly the wolves are the biggest project, but I think they could have put a bit more detail into their appearance of how to make them look realistic. The cinematography has its moments, though not many of them. Views of the Italian countryside and cities seem to be the best accomplishments, but they were pretty short. Now almost any male viewer of this video is probably thinking, who gives a crap about the romance? What about the action? Well, I'll say that some of the fight scenes were well carried out, but half the time, it felt like Zack Snyder came in to direct the action scenes with his classic slow-mo mania. I'm certain that if you're a Twilight fan, you'll be thrilled with the end result of this movie, but it feels like that's the only category that this film pleases, which is a pity for those who are going to see the movie and haven't read any of the books. Personally, I don't have a problem with the Twilight books. I just think that something that works well on paper isn't always golden material on the big screen. For the most part, there are things in the film that do seem to raise their standards compared to the last movie, but there's just way too much fat that could have been trimmed, performances that could have been better, a script that needed some work on it, but overall, a better film than its predecessor, but not by much. My rating for New Moon is a 4 out of 10. Well, now that the review's done, I can finally get this over with.